In the mountains, the shortest way is from summit to summit. But for that, you must have long legs. Aphorisms should be summits, and those to whom they are addressed should be tall and lofty. I find myself in the Swiss Alps, specifically in Upper Engadine, at 2,300 meters above the sea, right above Sils Maria, a location privileged by the late Nietzsche. Nietzsche discovered by accident Sils Maria in 1881. He called it Perla Perlissima, and he spent most of his summers in his late period, starting in 81 with a break, and then from 83 till 88. And it is in this context, in this environment, that Nietzsche found the right climate for his body, his sick body, and the right inspiration for his latest writings, specifically Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The aphorism with which I started about the summits already tells us something fundamental about Nietzsche and how to read Nietzsche. It stems from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, from a section in part 1 titled On Reading and Writing. Nietzsche famously said that the modern man should be a little bit like cows, or should learn from cows, specifically the ability to ruminate, that is, to repeat and chew and take time to assimilate writings like food and assimilate them in their body and not only in their mind. And so we can take this aphorism as a starting point of a rumination on Nietzsche. It already tells us something fundamental, namely that summits and aphorisms are similar. They're pinnacles of matter, but also of the spirit. And the writer, and at one remove the reader, should approach the aphorism in a specific frame of mind. The reader, Nietzsche says, is supposed to have long legs to travel from summit to summit, from aphorism to aphorism. You can cover a lot of ground that way. And that already tells us that for Nietzsche, writing and reading are physical activities. They are not located only in the mind, but they take place in the body. And Nietzsche is very much a philosopher of the body. He famously said that only thoughts that come while walking are worthwhile. And so yes, Nietzsche is indeed a philosopher of the body. And he occupies a privileged place in the Homo Mimeticus project. And so what I like to do in this talk is to take you on a hike across two pinnacles in Nietzsche's thoughts by taking the thread of mimesis as a guiding path, if you want. In part 1, I'll be speaking about Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and specifically the notion of the Ubermensch, which caused much confusion among readers of Nietzsche. And the second part will be more focused on Nietzsche as a philosophical physician who offers a diagnostic of mimesis. So a hike through two summits on Nietzsche's thoughts, one dealing with Zarathustra and one with a diagnostic of mimesis. Nietzsche rented a room in Sils Maria, a small room with a small desk and a small window looking outside, and there he would be transcribing his thoughts, the thoughts that came while walking, when he had good days. In worse days, and that would be most often the case, he would be laying on his bed suffering from terrible migraines caused partly by his poor sight, and probably meditating the thoughts that came while walking, and meditating about possibility of overcoming this physical illness. Nietzsche's thought is very much about self-overcoming, and this self-overcoming is not only a personal endeavor, but also a larger cultural and philosophical project that is central to his work in general, and specifically to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The notion of self-overcoming and the transformation of the spirit that goes along with it, and thus of the body, because the spirit for Nietzsche is linked to the body, is central to an opening section of Thus Spoke Zarathustra titled On the Three Metamorphoses of the Spirit. And I'd like to walk you through these three metamorphoses via the guiding thread of mimesis, or the guiding path of mimesis. Nietzsche speaks of three metamorphoses of the spirit, how the spirit became a camel, and a camel a lion, and the lion a child. And mimesis plays a key role in these transformations. Nietzsche says that there is a certain reverence of the spirit that leads the spirit to become a camel, and the camel kneels down and says, "Put a burden on me." And the heavier the burden, the stronger the camel. Now notice that the camel is a herd animal, and the burden that is put on the camel's back is the burden of values that come from the past. It's the burden of education. It's the burden that every student has to assimilate. So you could think of the camel as the student who has to learn in whatever discipline thoughts and ideas of the past. The camel in certain ways passive, submissive, and accepts this burden. Nietzsche was himself a student of classical philology. He studied philology and not philosophy, and went through this phase, the phase of the camel, of assimilating the thoughts of the Greeks specifically, that he then taught to his students in Basel. So the heavier the burden of the past, of education, the stronger the camel. But this is still a very passive attitude towards knowledge, which requires a second step or a second metamorphosis. And this takes place as the camel runs into the desert. And in the desert, the camel turns into a lion. The task of the lion is to kill a dragon, who is lord of the desert. And the dragon has scales, and on every scale there is written, "Thou shalt." Moral imperatives that are 2,000 years old, and some of them are recent, and that the lion is fighting against. The task of the lion is to oppose the "Thou shalt" of the dragon with "I will." There is thus a tension between the dragon, which once again embodies moral imperatives from the past that are passed down through education, that are passed down also through a form of imitation, and the lion, which stands for an individual, aggressive, destructive stance, which is deeply anti-mimetic. A certain negation, a secret naysaying, is thus necessary in this second metamorphosis of the spirit in order to oppose the mimetic values of the past. But the lion is still not in a position to create new values. And for that, a third metamorphosis of the spirit is needed, when the lion becomes a child. And the child is innocence and joy and affirmation. It's a first movement and a self-propelled wheel. Ein auf sich selbst rollendes Rad, says Nietzsche. This image of a child, like a wheel turning upon himself, stands for Nietzsche for a form of creativity and affirmation of values and the becoming of life and the turning of life. Specifically here in Sils Maria, on the lake of Silvaplana, not far from Surlei, Nietzsche came across a boulder, and he had the intuition of the eternal return of the same, an enigmatic philosophical notion which led Nietzsche to affirm or to say yes to life and to its returning. This intuition led Nietzsche to develop an affirmative ethics that entail affirming life, not only once, but in its repetition. He posited the idea that every moment that we have lived would recur again and again. And the position of the child should be the one that embraces this eternal cycle of becoming, of returning of the same, and saying yes, both in its good and evil manifestation. Now I will tell you the history of Zarathustra, the basic conception of the work, the idea of the eternal recurrence, the highest formula of affirmation which can ever be reached, belongs to August 1881. It is dashed off on a sheet of paper signed 6,000 feet beyond humanity and time. On that day, I was walking through the woods along Lake Silvaplana. I stopped at a huge, towering, pyramid-shaped boulder not far from Surlei. There this thought came to me. Ecce homo. The child is also linked to another concept that is central to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and that is the concept of the Ubermensch. Now, the Ubermensch has been very much misinterpreted, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, as Nietzsche's ideas were disseminated by Nietzsche's sister, who was an anti-Semite, and that led to the caricature of the Ubermensch as a superman, as a nationalist, fascist, and Nazi figure. Notice that Nietzsche is very far removed, actually very opposed to that image of the Ubermensch. The child is innocence and affirmation and play and affirms life. And Nietzsche describes the Ubermensch in Thus Spoke Zarathustra as a bridge towards the future, and a goal or an arrow that leads to a transformation humans have to undergo. And I would like to argue in the second part of this talk that the notion of mimesis or imitation, which is negative in the three metamorphoses of the spirit, also plays a positive affirmative role in this transformative view of life that the child, qua Ubermensch, affirms. So I conclude by reading a passage from Thus Spoke Zarathustra that I think continues to speak today. Zarathustra says, "I beseech you, my brothers, stay true to the earth and do not believe those who talk of over-earthly hopes. They're poisonous mixers, whether they know it or not."